Welcome. May God bless your day and your week ahead. You are joining us for a brand new deep dive, and today we have a really fascinating mission ahead of us.
We definitely do. It's a great one.
Yeah, we are cracking open the study notes from the Holman and NAA Bibles, and we're going to explore the factual, historical, and prophetic layers of Matthew chapter 2.
Which is a text that, it carries so much cultural baggage.
Oh, completely.
And the notes we are looking at do just a phenomenal job of stripping away the centuries of accumulated folklore, to get at the raw history underneath.
Right, because I know you, the listener, are here for exactly that reason. You want the substance, not just the surface-level summary.
Yeah, the real story.
Exactly. We all grew up with the greeting card version of the Nativity. You know the one.
The peaceful, silent night.
Right. Three kings in immaculate robes standing around a wooden manger, the glowing star hovering right above them. But the reality mapped out in these historical notes it's completely different.
It really is. It's jarring.
It's a gritty, high-stakes political thriller. We're talking ancient astrology, a deeply paranoid tyrant, massive foreign entourages, and desperate midnight escapes.
The contrast between that cultural myth and the historical reality of first-century Judea is, it's night and day. The study notes provide a geopolitical context that turns this from a quiet Sunday school story into a highly volatile diplomatic crisis.
So let's start right there with the catalyst of that crisis, the Magi.
The famous three kings.
Right. The historical record immediately dismantles two massive misconceptions about them. First, the text never actually states there were three of them.
It doesn't.
And second, they were absolutely not kings.
Not at all.
The number three only became a tradition centuries later, and that was just because of the three specific commodities they brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Right. The term itself, Magi, points to a very specific class of people. They weren't monarchs governing territories.
But who were they?
They were scholars, astrologers, and dream interpreters.
Mm-hmm.
The historical consensus places their origin in the East, likely Babylon or Persia.
Okay.
They were essentially the highly educated elite. Think of them as the political advisors and scientists of their day.
And if we look at the historical timeline, their interest in a Jewish king isn't just some random event.
No, there's a deep connection there.
Right, because anyone familiar with the Old Testament exile knows that centuries prior, the Jewish people were deported to Babylon.
Exactly.
And the prophet Daniel was actually appointed as the chief prefect over the Babylonian wise men, the Magi of his era. So there is a direct historical pipeline there.
That historical pipeline is crucial to understand. Because of that Jewish exile, these Babylonian and Persian scholars had access to Hebrew scriptures for centuries.
They weren't flying blind.
Not at all. They would have been intimately familiar with texts like Numbers 24.
Which prophesies a star rising out of Jacob.
And a scepter rising out of Israel.
Exactly. They were astronomers armed with ancient Jewish theology, actively watching the skies for a very specific geopolitical event.
Which brings us to the logistics of their journey, because the notes detail the sheer scale of this expedition, and it totally shatters the image of three guys riding quietly on
It
camels.
was a massive undertaking.
Right, they traveled approximately 1,290 kilometers. That's roughly 800 miles across brutal, unforgiving terrain.
Yeah.
At the typical travel speed of an ancient caravan, that is easily a 40-day journey.
And a journey of that magnitude, especially when you're carrying highly valuable treasures, requires serious infrastructure.
Right, you don't just wander the desert with chests of gold.
Exactly. You don't cross the ancient Near East without a massive entourage. We were talking about armed guards, servants, supply wagons, a very large caravan.
That context completely changes the dynamic of their arrival.
It does. When the text says they arrived in Jerusalem asking about a newborn king of the Jews and that the whole city was troubled by it, it finally makes sense.
It wasn't just a few guys knocking on a door.
No. A small foreign army of Parthian kingmakers rolling into the capital city isn't a quaint religious moment. It is a diplomatic shockwave.
It was an event that commanded the immediate attention of the entire Roman-occupied territory. And there's another significant detail the notes clarify regarding their arrival, which is the timeline.
Right, the timing is completely off from the myths.
The cultural myth puts the Magi at the manger on the actual night of the birth, but the historical and linguistic evidence places them arriving up to 2 years later.
The Greek phrasing is very specific there, which I found fascinating in the sources. They enter a house, an oikia, and they find a child, a paidion.
Which suggests a toddler.
Exactly, not an infant in a manger. The family had clearly transitioned out of temporary lodging and settled into domestic life in Bethlehem by that point.
Yeah, they had a house.
But there is a massive theological friction here regarding the Magi's navigation system that the sources bring up.
Oh, the astrology element.
Yeah.
It is a profound paradox. Because throughout the Old Testament, the Torah explicitly and repeatedly condemns astrology, divination, and the reading of omens.
It's strictly forbidden practice.
Forbidden. Yet, the narrative presents a divine reality where a celestial event, whether that was a planetary conjunction like Jupiter and Saturn, or a comet, or a localized supernatural light, is used to guide these pagan astrologers to the Messiah.
It creates a fascinating theological tension. The Orthodox rules say astrology is out of bounds, right? But the historical narrative shows a divine willingness to meet these foreign scholars exactly where they are.
Using their own language, essentially.
Yes, using their own flawed pagan systems to draw them toward a greater truth. It subverts the rigid religious categories of the day.
It demonstrates that divine providence just isn't constrained by human theological borders.
That's a great way to put it.
But while the Magi are following this star, their arrival in Jerusalem triggers a deadly reaction from the man currently sitting on the throne.
Right. To understand the violence of Matthew chapter 2, you really have to understand the psychology of King Herod the Great.
You do?
The study notes paint a chilling portrait of Herod. He governed Judea from 37 BC to 4 AD, and his title, King of the Jews, was entirely artificial.
He wasn't even Jewish by birth.
No, he was an Idumean, an Edomite. He had absolutely no ancestral right to the throne of David. He was essentially a political opportunist who had been handed the kingdom by the Roman Senate.
And because of that illegitimacy, he was despised by the Jewish populace, and he knew it.
Oh, he definitely knew it.
His entire reign was defined by an all-consuming paranoia regarding his grip on power. I mean, this is a ruler who built massive, seemingly impenetrable fortress palaces like Masada and the Herodium.
It's just massive structures.
Yeah, and specifically to have a secure place to flee in the event of a Jewish uprising. He was terrified of his own people.
His historical resume is basically a bloodbath. He was so terrified of losing his throne that he executed his own beloved wife, Miriam.
He executed his mother-in-law, too.
And several of his own sons on mere suspicion of treason.
The Roman Emperor Augustus famously joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son.
Wow.
Yeah. So when a massive caravan of Eastern dignitaries arrives in his capital asking for the coordinates of the legitimate, newly born king of the Jews,
Herod doesn't see a religious curiosity.
no, he sees a verified political coup. He views it as an existential threat. So he immediately convenes the highest religious authorities in the land, the chief priests and the scribes.
To pinpoint the exact location of this prophesied Messiah. And the religious leaders don't even hesitate. They instantly quote the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. They know the precise location is Bethlehem.
Instantly.
But the notes highlight a staggering contrast here between the pagan magi and these Jewish religious elites.
The geographical reality makes the contrast incredibly sharp. Because Bethlehem is located a mere 10 kilometers, about 6 miles south of Jerusalem.
Base right there.
You can practically see the ridges of Bethlehem from the outskirts of the capital.
So the Magi, who have no covenant, no temple, and no daily access to the Torah, sacrifice months of their lives. They travel nearly 1,300 kilometers across deserts just to worship.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the scribes, the theological experts whose entire vocation is studying the messianic prophecies, possess the exact location. It's an afternoon's walk away.
And they don't go.
They don't go. They couldn't be bothered to travel 10 kilometers to verify the fulfillment of the scriptures they dedicated their lives to memorizing.
It is a devastating portrait of theological apathy.
It really is.
They possess perfect intellectual knowledge, but it generated zero devotion. They provided the data Herod needed, but remained completely detached from the reality of what that data actually meant.
And that detachment leaves the door wide open for Herod to enact a nightmare.
It does.
Once the Magi are warned in a dream to bypass Herod and return to their own country, Herod realizes he's been outmaneuvered. At the same time, Joseph receives a midnight warning to take Mary and the child and flee immediately to Egypt.
The logistics of that escape are crucial to point out. The notes map out that the Egyptian border was roughly 120 kilometers away from Bethlehem.
Which is a long way on foot.
While still a grueling journey for a family with a toddler, crossing that border meant crossing out of Herod's political jurisdiction. He had no authority in Roman Egypt.
This flight to Egypt is where the notes really lean into the broader literary and theological architecture of Matthew's account. Because Matthew is deliberately presenting Jesus as the new Moses.
Yes.
And he expects his first-century Jewish readers to immediately catch the parallels.
The structural typologies are undeniable there. In the Exodus narrative, an evil tyrant pharaoh orders the systemic slaughter of Hebrew infants in a desperate attempt to neutralize God's deliverer.
Yep.
Moses survives that massacre, comes out of Egypt, and leads his people out of physical slavery.
And here, Matthew frames Herod as the new pharaoh, a new tyrant ordering the slaughter of Hebrew infants to destroy the promised king.
Exactly.
Jesus survives the localized massacre, is called out of Egypt, which Matthew actually links to the prophecy in Hosea, and returns to lead his people out of the spiritual slavery of sin.
It's a complete parallel.
The ultimate deliverer that the history of Moses foreshadowed has finally arrived.
It is a masterful theological synthesis. But we do have to address the grim historical reality of what Herod did in Bethlehem after the family fled.
We do.
Operating on the timeline provided by the Magi, his paranoia tipped into pure homicidal rage. He ordered the execution of all male children in Bethlehem and its surrounding vicinity who were 2 years old and under.
The massacre of the innocents, it's horrific, and it brings up a very prominent skeptical question that our sources tackle directly. Critics frequently point out that secular historians of the era, particularly the Jewish historian Josephus, never recorded this specific massacre. If a king slaughters a town's children, the argument goes, it should be in the history books.
It is a logical question to ask, but the historical and demographic context provides a very sobering answer to that. We have to look at the actual size of first-century Bethlehem.
It wasn't a major city.
No, it was a tiny, rural, obscure village. Demographers estimate the total population was likely only a few hundred people.
Which drastically changes the mathematics of the event. We often picture hundreds or even thousands of children being killed because classical artwork depicts it that way.
Right, sweeping dramatic paintings.
Exactly. But the statistical reality of a village that small means the number of boys aged 2 and under was likely somewhere between 10 and 30.
Now, for the families involved, it was an apocalyptic, world-shattering loss. The grief is unimaginable.
Unimaginable.
But historically speaking, the localized murder of a dozen peasant children in a rural outpost by a king known for mass executions barely registered on the geopolitical radar.
That's the tragic reality of it, because Josephus documents Herod burning political rivals alive, executing hundreds of military leaders, and ordering the deaths of prominent Jewish nobles.
He was constantly killing people.
Against the backdrop of a 40-year reign defined by towering, widespread atrocities, a targeted hit in a shepherd village simply wouldn't have made the Roman news dispatches.
No.
The silence of secular historians doesn't disprove the event at all. It merely reflects the horrific reality of how cheap peasant life was under the Herodian dynasty.
It is a dark reflection of the political climate of the Roman Empire at the time. Eventually, however, the tyrant dies. Herod's death in 4 AD signals a potential safe return for the family.
But the geopolitical landscape remained incredibly dangerous.
The danger just changed hands.
Exactly. Upon Herod's death, his kingdom was partitioned among his sons. The region of Judea, which included Bethlehem, fell under the rule of Archelaus. And the historical notes confirm that Archelaus inherited all of his father's cruelty, but none of his political competence.
He was a mess.
He was so notoriously brutal and chaotic that the Roman Emperor Augustus eventually had to step in, depose him, and banish him to Gaul.
So realizing that Judea was still a death trap under Archelaus, Joseph receives another divine warning. Instead of returning to the south, the family pivots entirely.
They head north.
They travel north to the region of Galilee, settling in an obscure, marginalized town called Nazareth.
And this geographical pivot to Galilee sets up the final and perhaps the most complex prophetic puzzle in Matthew chapter 2.
It's a tricky one.
The text concludes by stating that Jesus, settling in Nazareth, fulfilled what was spoken by the prophets, quoting, "He shall be called a Nazarene."
Yeah.
The glaring issue here, which the notes address, is that if you read the entire Old Testament from Genesis to Malachi, there is no explicit verse that says, "He shall be called a Nazarene."
It is a famous textual mystery. But the study notes from the Holman and NAA Bibles provide a brilliant twofold explanation to unlock what Matthew's actually doing here.
Let's hear it.
The first key is linguistic. It relies on a deep Hebrew wordplay.
It centers around Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, right?
Yes.
Which is a major messianic prophecy stating that a branch will grow from the roots of Jesse, the father of King David. The specific Hebrew word used for branch in that text is netzer.
Exactly. Netzer and Nazareth share the exact same root consonants.
Ah,
Matthew is utilizing this linguistic connection to link the geographical title Nazarene to the prophetic title of the branch, or netzer.
that's clever.
He is subtly affirming Jesus' Davidic lineage, despite the fact that he is now growing up far away from the royal city of David.
That handles the linguistic side beautifully. But the sources also provide a second, deeply sociological reason for this specific prophecy, tied directly to the cultural reputation of Galilee in the first century.
Nazareth was an utterly despised village.
Utterly despised.
Estimates place its population at maybe a few hundred people at most.
No.
It had no cultural influence, no economic power, and no religious prestige.
Nothing going for it.
It was viewed with intense prejudice by the religious elites down in Jerusalem. We actually see this later in the Gospel of John when Nathanael famously asks, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?"
To be labeled a Nazarene wasn't just a neutral geographical descriptor, it was an insult.
It was a slur, essentially.
Yeah, it meant you were a backwater peasant. You were a nobody from nowhere, entirely lacking in cultural credibility.
And that sociological reality fulfills the broader, overarching prophetic theme found throughout the entire Old Testament, particularly in texts like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22.
The suffering servant texts.
Right. The prophets repeatedly stated that the Messiah would not arrive as a celebrated, elite aristocrat draped in institutional power. He would be a despised and rejected figure, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief.
So the location matters.
Yes. Matthew is pointing out that even the obscure, marginalized town he grew up in, Wadle, fulfilled the prophecy that the Messiah would be culturally written off.
It perfectly ties together the overarching theme of this entire historical deep dive. The narrative we've explored today shows that history isn't just a chaotic sequence of tyrant kings and political maneuvers.
No, there's a thread.
Beneath the surface of Roman occupations and Herodian paranoia, there is an intricate, purposeful design at work.
And it completely upends the traditional metrics of power and importance. The divine purpose consistently operates outside the recognized institutional structures.
We see that at every turn in this text. I mean, think about it. A celestial event guides pagan scientists, not high priests.
Exactly.
A refugee's desperate flight mirrors the great exodus of a nation. And the prophesied king of the universe grows up in a marginalized village that the cultural elites used as a punchline.
It's profound.
The people who had all the right theological credentials missed it entirely, while the people who were completely outside the religious system recognized the truth.
It is a profound challenge to how we evaluate truth and authority. The evidence is always there, but our cultural prejudices often determine whether or not we actually engage with it.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you to consider as you go about your week. We just discussed how the title Nazarene was an insult, a way for the educated elites of Jerusalem to dismiss Jesus because he lacked the proper cultural pedigree and came from the wrong zip code.
Right.
It makes you wonder about our own era. In a society that is absolutely obsessed with credentials, elite platforms, and algorithmic popularity, are we aggressively dismissing world-changing truths or profound insights simply because they come from the wrong, marginalized voices?
That's a great question.
If the ultimate truth emerged from the ultimate cultural blind spot in the first century, what are we culturally writing off today simply because it doesn't fit our metrics of prestige? It is certainly something to mull over.
A very challenging reality to leave on. History has a habit of repeating those exact patterns of dismissal.
It absolutely does. Well, that wraps up our exploration of the historical and prophetic layers of Matthew chapter 2. We hope unpacking these study notes brought a totally new perspective to a narrative you thought you already knew. Goodbye, and God blesses all of you listening.